Today we have our moderator, Bori Bradshaw. She is a planning and analyst based in the mountains on the California coast. She first joined Toastmaster to find her voice and improve her presentation skills. When she moved cross country and accepted her first job in the Silicon Valley, in Toastmaster, she found confidence, poise, and professional skill, but more importantly, a passion for learning, leading, mentoring, coaching, and collaborating. She continues her journey through a bi-coastal Toastmaster experience with District 36 on both coasts, East and West. In her free time, she embraced another passion, photography, taking photo journeys through the beautiful beaches and forests of California and beyond. Ladies, let's welcome our moderator for our podcast session today, Bori Bradshaw. Bori, the tour is yours.
Thank you, everyone. I finally got the sun out of my face here, my very strategically placed scarf, so I can focus on what we're doing here today. So happy to be here, and we have great panelists with some really great information and ideas for us, especially Sonia on your journey here. This is going to be a lesson for you. We've got all of our sheroes here. They're going to tell you exactly how to get going here, and the rest of us who are interested in podcasts as well. So if I could have my panelists please come on camera, and then you could take your mic when it's your turn to speak, please. I think that way we can see each of you and can interact with each other. I am going to introduce our panelists. First is Chioma. She's a global health and development practitioner with experience in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. She holds a master's in public health and is passionate about improving access to healthcare and sexual reproductive health rights for women. She currently works as a program manager for a DC-based nonprofit. Outside of her 9-to-5, Chioma hosts a podcast with her friends. I'm going to go ahead and let her explain the rest of the podcast. So Chioma, please tell us the name of your podcast and the subject and how you chose this.
Thank you, Bori, and I'm so glad to be speaking with you all today. The name of my podcast is Panadol Extra Pod. So the name comes from, there's a drug called Panadol Extra. It's sort of like Tylenol. It's very popular in Asia and Africa. And my podcast is primarily based on the Nigerian immigrant experience. And in Nigeria, when you have a headache or any kind of pain, you usually go buy Panadol. And so we decided to come up with this podcast using that name. I will give a backstory. The podcast has not always been called Panadol Extra. We actually transitioned to Panadol Extra about a year ago. So it used to be called The Ocala Diaries, and it was a podcast that I co-hosted with my best friend, and we just basically merged our last names together and called it Ocala. It didn't really have a real meaning to it, but that was a different podcast, and now I host Panadol Extra. So that's just the background about my podcast, and we can get into more of it later.
Absolutely, thank you for that. It's a really great story. I like getting the change into more purposeful messaging and branding on your podcast. It's really an excellent strategy. And I will have other questions and things for later on so we can share some more information. Our next podcast participant in our panel today is Natalie. The need for fostering deep, fundamental social change has always resonated deeply and intensely in Natalie's bones. She is an environmental, social, and governance leadership coach, a trusted advisor and consultant. Her work addresses various societal issues and brings awareness of the unique cultures, politics, and economies that characterize different regions around the world. She collectively designs, develops, and implements global strategies and programs in which individuals and teams of employees from Fortune 100 organizations strategically engage in underserved communities. She advises companies on corporate responsibility, social issue leadership, employee engagement, and related areas with the goal of creating initiatives that strengthen business and impact society. Natalie, could you please come on the mic and explain to us the title of your podcast and then the subject and how you chose them?
Hey, good morning, and thank you, Lori. The title of my podcast is called Conscious Evolution, The Journey. It's actually really funny how this podcast came about. So as a social impact advisor, I like to travel the world, and during the pandemic, literally grounded me. And I had picked up a habit. I won't call it a bad habit because it's all relative, but I had this ability to always go and get a cup of coffee at a local, cafe every single morning. And then the pandemic hit, and all of a sudden I was stuck at home with, no coffee, but I would still find a way, mask and all, to get coffee. So anyways, our roommate and my business partner for the podcast and I, she had her coffee every morning in one of these cups, just like I'm holding, and it was all frothy and fancy. And I would keep going to whatever cafe I was going to because I was trying to recreate this experience of pre-pandemic, because we're all struggling with this change. And I was like, I'm going to hold on to something. And one day she was like, here's your own, beautiful latte in a nice cup. And so she comes back, and next thing we started thinking about this whole transformation of me sitting at home, doing what I'm doing right now and drinking my coffee and saving myself $5. And my husband, of course, was thrilled. And as we started talking, relaxing and just really feeling, and I felt like I had, recreated this experience where I had Gwen's voice in my background talking about what if tomorrow never comes. I was, and we were trying to essentially, as it was been said, maximize the chapter. All of a sudden we're like, oh, this is conscious evolution. This was literally what was happening. And all of our conversations, all we wanted to do was like, okay, how do we amplify our thoughts and our voices around this awesome transformation? And so that's how Conscious Evolution, The Journey was born. And we talk about our framework for consciously evolving, rethinking the way we live our lives, and really getting in touch with the experience of life and what does that mean for our leadership. That's a quick story behind the podcast.
Thank you, Natalie. That's an awesome background story. It helps so much as we're each considering the possibility of starting our own podcast to really understand how it evolves, how it becomes a thing, and how the subjects are chosen. So we appreciate the background for that as well. Our third panelist is Christina. Christina is a change agent with experience grounded in education, organization development, training, and public service. She coaches and collaborates with executive leaders, teams, and organizations to improve performance, culture, and stakeholder value. Christina began her professional career as a Teach for America Corps member, and her work as an educator helped her to see the importance of understanding one's own bias, privilege, and cultural lens when helping to unveil the lenses of others. She has now brought that lens to government on both a local and a federal level. Christina earned an MS in Organization Development from American University. She also holds an MA in Urban Education from University of Maryland and a BA in English from Fordham University. Outside of work, Christina has been a member of Toastmasters since 2012, where she has achieved the highest level award, the Distinguished Toastmaster Award, for completing various levels of communication and leadership accomplishments. And today we would like to ask you, Christina, if you could tell us the title of your podcast and its subject, and again, a backstory or how you made the choice of the subject.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. If you see me laughing, it's because I'm looking at the chat. You guys have me cracking up. And I will always shout out her mentee. So shout out to Anna, my mentor. So the title of my podcast is Silent Podcast. And I had notes, I'm not going to use them. I'm trying to do too much right now. And I know this, right? So here I go. The title of my podcast is Silent Podcast. And it came about because I'm on a nonprofit board. I'm the director of operations of a nonprofit called the Ruby Ball Foundation. And the purpose of the foundation is to kind of get rid of the stigma of sickle cell disease and to spread awareness, to raise money for foundations that are helping to end sickle cell. And we came up with the podcast in general because what we do, our big fundraising thing for the year is to do a gala, but we have not been able to do that because of the pandemic. And then the year before that, the founder of the Ruby Ball Foundation, she got really sick and she has sickle cell. So, 2020, we were having one of our board meetings and we were like, we need to find a way to continue to amplify voices, even though we can't have this gala. And so we were like, how about we do a podcast? Like podcast, people are doing, because we were in the pandemic, people were doing a lot of, there was, what's the name? Someone talked about it in the networking session. Clearly I'm not a member. Oh, Clubhouse. And then there were a lot of podcasts that were coming out and it just seemed really relevant. So we decided to give it a go. So we started the podcast and launched it on World Sickle Cell Awareness Day. And the reason why we called it Silent is because, or the reason why we chose the name in general, Silent has so many connections to sickle cell disease. First of all, sickle cell is a silent disease. You can't just look at someone and tell that they have sickle cell. And it's also silenced in a couple of ways. One, when people who have sickle cell, they go into crisis and they go to the emergency room, a lot of times they're silenced because they're not believed that they're in pain. Sickle cell is a disease that predominantly affects people of color, especially in this country. And so there are some stigmas with medicine and people believing that Black people are in pain. So there's some silence there. There's also silencing that people who have the disease silence themselves. We actually had a podcast episode where we met with a doctor who didn't disclose that she had sickle cell because she was afraid she'd be fired, right? So there's just, we've seen it in our different conversations come up. So we chose that name because sickle cell is a disease that's silenced. And the purpose of the podcast is to strike out the silenced voices of the disease.
Thank you, Christina. That's an excellent story. I love the background on the podcast as well. And we being there, being the voice for those who don't have a voice or are being silenced is an excellent subject for the podcast as well, or purpose. As we're going through, we've got some questions that I wanted to bring up and ask for information from our three podcasting sheroes so that we can get some more ideas of how the mechanics of everything works and other ways that we can be successful as podcasters. If you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat and I will try to catch them as they scroll through because things kind of move a little quickly during the meeting. The next thing I would like to talk about is your audience. Now, who is your audience and how do you promote your podcast to help to draw in a broader audience and to really reach out to them? Chioma, what would you have advice would you have on the audience question?
Yes, I think when you start a podcast, audience is one of the maybe top 3 things you have to think about. I always tell people that you cannot make a product for everyone. You want it to be for everyone, but you cannot sometimes make it for everyone. For my podcast, I host it with 3 other people. We are all Nigerian Americans. We've all lived here now most of our lives, but we come with that experience. And so when we have topics, the topics that we tend to have are about the Nigerian American or even the Black American experience sometimes. We've had topics where we talk about being Black in America, not just as an African American, but as a Nigerian within the Black community, and how sometimes there are some tensions that occur within that as well, where you are feeling sometimes Africans feel that they're better than African Americans or the other way around. So we've had those kind of conversations. So when we determine our audience, we try to determine it by what topic are we trying to get across. If we are talking about being Black in America, if we're talking about mental health, we know that majority of the people that are going to listen to the episodes are Nigerian or Black American And sometimes if we have friends outside of those circles, we'll share it with them. So we have a Facebook page, we have a Twitter page, we have on SoundCloud, we interact with other podcasts as well. We also share it on Instagram. And within our own circles, there's 4 of us, so we each have our own circles. So we share it within our circles as well. So it may expand beyond the audience of Nigerians or Black Americans to other people, but we know that primarily that's who's listening to our podcast. And we're not going to pretend that we have other people that may listen, maybe just for interest, but I don't think the topics will be as interesting or perhaps as important to them. And so we try to think about that when we come up with our audience and our topics.
Excellent. It sounds like you really know your audience, and that would be key, I think, is to understand who you're talking to, because that can help you to narrow down the subjects that you can talk about and to really make it purposeful and meaningful. Natalie, what would you add to that? How about your audience and how do you promote?
Well, so I have a different approach, and hopefully it could, for those might be, I am working towards where Chioma is in terms of understanding and knowing my audience. When we started this podcast, we did not know. Honestly, we just had an idea and we were like, all right, let's do what Sonia has said in terms of be intentional with our voice on this idea. Let's talk about this framework, and kind of the process is what we were aiming for. Like, what would we like to create a podcast? And what would we talk about? Like, how do we take our conversations from the couch to the podcast to share and then let it evolve from there, because that's what we're talking about. And it forced us to actually bring voice to an idea. And so our audience really, unfortunately, was a general audience. But we know that we didn't, but the first season, that's what it was. The second season that we did, we got better. It's kind of a process. And now that we're going into our 3rd season this fall, I think we're in a place where we can start putting, who are we really speaking to about these things and why would it matter to them? So honestly, the podcast is a way of us discovering what, who our audience is and what value these ideas may or may not have. And also for our own confidence in being able to be like, all right, we've never done this before. Let's just jump in. And that's just kind of been my approach on things. Unfortunately, it's not very organized and as thought out as I wanted it to be, but I also knew that if I waited too long to think out every little detail, I would never do it. So that's what I want to add. But Chioma, thank you, because I really think that that's where we're heading to next, and where we are getting to a place where we're going to put some more, to evolve the purpose of this podcast.
I'll jump in. Natalie, I love that as like a research tool for figuring out who your audience is. That's a great idea. Chioma, I 100% agree with you that you have to know your audience and kind of speak to them. I think I fall in between both Natalie and Chioma because our goal with the podcast, obviously, we're speaking to the sickle cell community, people who have sickle cell, people who are impacted by sickle cell. But in our intro, we also say anyone in general. And the reason why is because sickle cell is a silent disease. And so there are people who are walking around in this world that don't know that they're a carrier of sickle cell. Like one of the most recent episode that we dropped, one of our guests, she didn't know that she had hemoglobin C, which is a gene that actually, if you marry someone and have a child with someone who has sickle cell trait, you have a child with sickle cells. She didn't know that, right? And so our goal is to make sure to raise awareness about sickle cell, which means not just to the people who know about the disease or to the people who know that they have the trait, but also to anyone in general, so that they're like, oh, shoot, maybe I should get tested for sickle cell. So if you're listening, yes, maybe you should go get tested for sickle cell because it's something that you can carry and it will be silent and you don't know that you have it. So.
Excellent. Thank you, Christina. I really like the way that each of you is working with each other here and giving us more information and building on each other's statements. It's very powerful and it's very helpful for those of us who are learning here. A question came up about pacing for the seasons. How many episodes per season? How do you delineate that? And I think that kind of is a general question that I had as well, is how do you plan for future episodes or future seasons? Let's see, Natalie, you're nodding. Did you want to start this time?
Oh, planning. So the first season we had kind of a little framework. We weren't completely without, like, our goal was to just get out and do it. And we had a framework, and we were like, okay, 6 episodes, right? We just wanted to commit to that much, right? 6 episodes, and we would call that season 1. I'm the idea person, like my business partner, she's the operations person, because otherwise we'd never get anything done. But we got together and did that. It wasn't much planning. It was like, can we just get together and talk through what the key points of our conversation would be? The second season, I whipped out the fancy little spreadsheets and broke it down and it was nice. It was a great plan. Yeah, we wanted to do 12. Then like life got in the way and then reality. And then it was like, do we really have to think about everything at this detail? Like it became, the plan was pretty. It was super pretty. No, it ended up being 6 again, which was fine. We had to change the scope of our season, and based on reality and based on the fact that as we were evolving with our ideas, it was taking more time to actually come up with, and especially since we weren't ready to invite other people, yet we wanted to be able to still, again, just set some foundation for it and really solidify some of the things and that we had done the previous season. But again, we left it at 6 seasons, and it's good for me, I felt like, to cut it off at a seasonal, whether it's 6 season, because it then puts less pressure, because you're competing against, well, not competing, you're looking at people who's producing 500 podcasts and they do one every week and it's ambitious. I'm like, no, we can't do that. We wanted to grow the podcast. We didn't really want to just, we wanted to grow ourselves in developing this podcast. So now as we go into 3, the season T, it's kind of an in-between where, yes, we do have a plan. No, we're both full-time jobs. Maybe we're going to aim for 8. But because we're doing it on a seasonal basis, right? You define your season. You don't have to have anybody else define the season for you. You don't have to put 12 in a season. It gives people a cutoff, and then you can relaunch. So it's a learning there. So that's kind of that. But if you're a great planner, that will save you, but it does require planning.
Thank you, Natalie. I like the reaction. It's spreadsheets. A spreadsheet. I'm really impressed. After all of our conversations, the spreadsheet. Exactly. Chioma, what would you like to add?
Man, spreadsheets. I need to get to that level. I'm not there yet. I've had 3 seasons of my podcast so far. The first season and a half were when it was previously called the Ocala Diaries. The last season and a half were Panadol Extra. So the structure has been kind of all over the place. Well, each season has had about 12 to 13 episodes. Now, it sounds like a lot. At the time when I first started a podcast, I would record with my co-host twice a month. We would do episodes twice a month. We were always so excited to record because she's my best friend. It was just time for us to chit chat. We would have a glass of wine. We would just talk, and we would have our friends from college that would listen, and they'd be like, oh, wow, what y'all talking about this week? So it was that was how it was. So now with Panadol Extra, we are recording from 4 different locations. So I'm here in Silver Spring. My other co-host is in Louisiana. The other co-host is in Atlanta. The other co-host used to be in Florida, and now he's moved to Atlanta. So we are just all over the place. And so we had to structure our podcast where we could only record once a month, because that really made sense for us. We don't know right now how many episodes we want to do. This last season was 12 episodes, and we just decided, and I think it's also based on the topics that we want to cover, right? So when you're planning sometimes we do it based on affinity months. So we're doing this panel because it's National Anti-Border Month, right? But we will do a topic on, if it's Black History Month, it was something to do with Black history. We had Mental Health Awareness Month. We did a topic on mental health awareness in the Black community, in the Nigerian community. So we try to structure our podcast kind of on a calendar where we're saying we're planning a topic based on something that we each want to talk about. And then that way we can say, okay, we want maybe 10 to 12 episodes this season, and then that will be it. Because I think sometimes when you overcommit and think you can record one episode a week, it's not going to happen, because podcasts take a lot to come up with content development. You have to produce it. You have to publicize it. It's quite a lot of work. So like I said, it's 3 seasons so far, 12 episodes in each season. And that's where we are.
That's excellent. And that actually leads into another really great question we got in the comments. How do you structure the discussions? How long does it take to plan and to prepare, to deliver and have this podcast ready to go live? What is the time commitment for this, and how does that happen? Christina, would you like to start this one?
Sure. And I'll jump on to answer that last question very briefly. We plan our podcast around events. So for example, World Sickle Cell Awareness Day passed on Juneteenth. So we dropped a podcast episode then. Sickle Cell Awareness Month is in September. We also had a private shopping event. So we try to plan the podcast around the different events that are happening. Now, as far as structure of the podcast, and I think that's what the question was, right? I'll scroll back up. I think Ashley asked that question. How do you typically structure your podcast discussions? Do you spend a whole episode on a topic? Yes. So we plan our podcast around topics and people, and we say, okay, who is this person that we want to talk to that's either in the sickle cell community or connected to it in some way? What can we talk about? So like one of the most recent podcasts we recorded was about love and sickle cell and how to navigate that. But the actual structure of our podcast, and I'm saying we, Ijeoma, she's the founder of the Ruby Ball Foundation. She and I are co-hosts. And so what you hear when you listen to the podcast is we are just kind of joining, we're previewing you of the conversation that we had. We have something called the Voice of Truth, where we do like a quote of the day and talk about how it connects to the conversation that we had. And then we go into the interview. But in real time, it happens where we have the interview first, and then after that interview, then we kind of do the debrief conversation and flip it. So, and then her question, she said, do you normally have guests? We always have guests on the podcast. That is part of the structure. It's to interview people and bring awareness and hear. Really, it's about thinking back about what Sonia said. It's about hearing and sharing stories of people, which is also why we try to make this relevant, not just to the sickle cell community, but to anybody who's listening.
Great. Thank you, Christina. I think that also is a good segue into kind of a related question about how is it different preparing for a podcast versus preparing for a speech here or for a presentation in a professional setting or something? Yes, Natalie, go ahead.
It's all of it. Every skill that you are learning, developing, practicing within Toastmasters, I will tell you, you will see. So I love doing interviews because it's a lot easier, it's more dynamic. And part of my own personal development through this development of the podcast is something that Lisa Simmons here has been coaching me on, is how to do storytelling and do it more effectively. Because as you noted, it's about telling stories. How am I going to keep somebody's attention? How much time do you keep their attention for? I feel like every podcast is a presentation and a speech when it's not a dialogue, right? Because the format of the podcast, right, they're structured, whether it is an interview format, all of it, you're really having to identify the purpose of your podcast episode every single time, and what are you going to do with that topic? It's one thing to have a topic, but then what do you want to do with it? Okay, then you got to break it down to, okay, how are you going to meet the goal of that purpose of that topic? For us, I will say that for me, that's kind of where my plan went to hell in a handbasket, because it was easy to schedule all these beautiful topics and et cetera and colorful spreadsheets. But it was when it came down to doing the work of preparing for a solo podcast, especially if you're doing a solo podcast, it's just your voice. I mean, I literally dissected other people's podcasts to understand how they do that, because I wanted to understand the techniques needed to do that. And these are the techniques that we do reinforce in Toastmasters. So it's all of it. It is all of it. But that's what makes it fun, because kind of like Sonia said, it's about being intentional about your voice in a public and published setting. So I'm going to put that there. Yeah, all of it.
Thank you, Natalie. I'm going to ask, Chioma came off microphone. I was just
Yeah.
going to ask you if you would like to add to this as well.
For me, my podcast, honestly, it's just time for me to chit chat with my friends and talk about things that we, maybe normally wouldn't have the opportunity to talk about in a broader arena. So I know one of the things as the host of the podcast I've had to learn is that I've had to be conscious of giving each person an opportunity to speak at some point. I have 3 other co-hosts, and 1 or 2 of them might decide on that episode, oh, I'm just going to be quiet on this episode. And I'm like, Chioma is not going to let you do that. So I'm going to point you out and be like, so Alice, tell me, what do you think about, today? So that's my role on the podcast, is that I'm always the one to say, oh, what do you think about this? And I'll tell them ahead of time, like, guys, I'm sorry, but I'm going to pick on you on this particular topic. And we've had on the one of our episodes, we had a guest that came to talk about polyamory. And he's a polyamorous, he has multiple partners, and he was very open about that. And that's not something that you hear people talking about a lot in the open. And so with us, we really had to control our reactions, but also ask meaningful questions, right? So in a way that we're not obviously coming from a judgmental point of view, but just tell us about this. What is this experience like? Why did you choose to go into this as a Nigerian, which is a bit odd. We don't talk about that kind of stuff. We barely talk about sex in public. So it's just one of those things that I had to come up with and have that, be open to having those kind of conversations. And then being conscious that allowing your guests to be able to speak as well. It's hard to do a solo podcast. I don't know how people do that. For myself, I don't like listening to myself talk, for one thing. So with the solo podcast, that's hard. I've never had to do that. I always have other people. So most of my job is just making sure that all opinions are heard. Everybody has an opportunity to speak and contribute to the conversation. And then I also have to be the one to kind of wrap it all up at the end and say, okay, this is the takeaway message. And, we'll maybe link it to the next episode if possible. If not, this is where it stands. And thank you everyone for listening. So I think for me, that's I've had to be the facilitator of the conversation.
Yeah, it's like being a table topics master. That's
Yes.
exactly what it's like. It's like being a table topics master, and you are listening so that you can respond to what the person has said after they've responded. I would also, and I know you asked about how they're different, but I'm also bringing in how they're the same. It's about how can I be the most authentic person that I can as I'm talking about this, because people listen and are engaged in authenticity, right? Like they don't want to hear you reading from something. They want to hear you speaking from the heart. So that's how it's similar, because that's what I try to do when I give a speech.
Oh, that's excellent, Christina. I like that. That's a great place for finishing our conversation here, is speaking from the heart. And I think that's something that is important in all of our communication. It's something we really focus on here in She Leads, She Speaks. And it's a great way to kind of wrap up everything we've talked about today. I know we've got some more questions over here, but we're running out of time. And Anne-Marie is like texting me going, you're running out of time. So we're going to go on to our evaluation portion of our meeting. But I want to thank Natalie, Christina, and Chioma for coming here today and sharing this. And there's a lot of other questions. So Maggie, make a note of that. This is a great idea for another education session very soon, because our Sheroes have so many more questions. Thank you for that. And I'm going to turn the meeting back over to Anne-Marie so we can move into our next